In Japanese, you've got the words igirisu and eikoku, but you don't really have a word that says Britain. You don't really have a word that says England, or even United Kingdom. I mean, what are these things? Okay? And in my experience, British people we usually know, but people outside Britain, in France or Spain or America or Japan, usually don't really know. Okay? And it's important for the understanding of the history at this time, because this is when these different parts of Britain, England and, well, we're going to see, okay? The other parts of Britain start to come together and make one big country. So I'm going to start with a map. Do you recognize this shape on the map? Yeah? Yeah? I think most people will recognize that shape. But what can we see? What does that map show us? Would anybody like to volunteer an answer? What can we see there? Sorry? Well, that's true. England, Scotland and Ireland are all in that map. Anything else? England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. They're all in there. But does the map show you which part is England or Scotland or Ireland? No. It's all there, but there are no lines that tell us which is England, which is Scotland. Okay? So it's not really a political map, is it? I mean, it's not showing you the political boundaries that humans have made. It just shows the natural landmass. What would we call that natural landmass without political connections? Because what is that geographically, not politically? Exactly. It's the British Isles, isn't it? Yeah, it's the British Isles. All right. So that's the first step here. Nature made this bit of land, and it's called the British Isles. Even that is not completely accepted. Some Irish people don't like using the word Britain for their island. They don't like to be the British Isles. They'd say, well, we're actually separate. But in most textbooks, in most geography books, most situations, people will use the British Isles to mean all of this. And it's a geographical name, it's not a political name. There's no political British Isles. Okay? Some of these isles down here, for example, they're part of the British Isles, but they're not part of the United Kingdom, for example. It's not. This shows a geographical region, and as you can see, some of it is nearer to France than to Britain. There are two main islands here, Britain and Ireland. Britain and Great Britain, what's the difference? Is there any difference? Not really. When the Roman people, 2,000 years ago, when the Roman people came to Britain, they passed through an area of France. This area of France was called Brittany, Britannia in Latin. And when they crossed over here, they found the same language, the same culture, the same people. But it was bigger than that part of France, this French Anton. Okay? So they called it Great Britain. In Latin, major means great or big. So basically they're saying there's Cisana Britain and Orkina Britain. Okay? Brittany in France is smaller than the island of Britain. And it's the same people with the same language, the same culture. So we're going to give it the same name. We're going to call one Brittany, Britannia, and the other one Britannia Major, Great Britain. Of course, later on in the Victorian period, or the Shokumichi Jidai, people started Great Britain, Sugoi Britain. We are better than everybody. We are great. And maybe some British people, with their Brexit ideas, think they can still be great. I think probably they're wrong, but that's what they may think. So we can say Britain or Great Britain for this island, and we can say Ireland, this is the name for this island. But those two are not political names. Very often people will say Britain or British when they mean United Kingdom. Okay? But it's a little bit different. Okay? But when you're reading the newspaper, when they say British, they mean Hotondo, United Kingdom. They don't just mean Konoshima dake. Alright? Kita Airurando ga haite iru no, Northern Ireland, which is the big complication for Brexit, and it's been a big complication throughout history. And again, it's an important part of our work on this course. What goes on up here in Northern Ireland. So we'll talk about that during this course. So now if we look at this, what have we got? What does this map show? We're here to, yes, it shows 4 countries, doesn't it? That shows where those 4 countries lie. All right, the boundary. So this is now a political map. Human beings decided that Scotland would be here. In fact, it was more or less the Romans who decided that when they built a wall across the country. But it's not quite right, because the Romans built their wall across here. Okay? And then through history, it sort of changed like that. The Romans tried to build another wall up here, so Scotland could have been pushed up, just this bit. But they weren't successful. So it's just an accident of history, really. I mean, obviously Ireland has a natural border, which is the sea. But the border between England and Wales, the border between England and Scotland, of course, those were made by human beings. So this is political map. This is a political map showing the 4 countries of England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. Okay? And for a long time, this was the basic division. During our period, basically, these 4 countries existed like this. Okay? If we go back 1,000 years, these countries were divided into smaller countries. If we go forward into the 18th, 19th centuries, these countries are united. But in our period, these countries are like this. And this is how it was for hundreds of years. The British Isles were divided into 4 countries. And these 4 countries have a very different culture. They have a very different history. I would say that 3 of them have a more similar culture and a more similar history, and 1 of them has a different culture and a different history. Which is the one that's most different? Which 3 are similar and which one is most different, do you think? Well, Ireland, I mean, in one way, Ireland is different because it's a separate island. That's true. But it wasn't the division that I was thinking of. I was thinking of something that goes back more into the history of the people. 3 of those countries have something that makes them similar. As well. Yeah, basically I'm going to leave it like that. one of them is culturally and historically very different. we're all kind of guessing now. Actually, Scotland and Ireland are very similar in a very important and basic way. They speak more or less the same language. There are some differences between the Irish language and the Scottish language, but they are very, very close. And those languages belong to a group of languages. Do you know what group of languages the Scottish and Irish languages belong to? What type of language? It starts with G. Come on. No. Gaelic. That's right. Gaelic or Celtic. That's right. And that's where the similarity comes in. The Scottish and the Irish are Gaelic or Celtic people, and so are the Welsh. The Welsh are a slightly different type of Celt, and their language is more different from Irish and Scottish, but they are Celtic people. Okay? So the history of the Celtic peoples is different from the history of the English. Looking at the language, we've said that Gaelic or Celtic, those are the languages, the original languages. Today, more or less, I think everybody speaks English, but there are still people who do not speak English at home or with their friends. They speak Irish or Welsh or Scottish. Okay. Especially Welsh is quite a strong language. Which one is older? These Celtic Gaelic languages or the English language? The Celtic languages are older. Okay? The Celtic people have been in these islands for longer than the English people. Okay? Now, we've got these Celtic languages, also spoken in parts of the north of France, like we said, Brittany, the original Brittany that the Romans found, that's also Celtic speaking. In total, there are 6 different Celtic languages. And the Celtic people have been in Britain and Ireland for much longer than the English people. Where did the English people come from? The Vikings are different. Yeah, I mean, I can understand that there's a sort of relationship, but it's not. They're rather different. You used the word. They were Germanic, and they came from Germany. And English is a Germanic language. Okay, for example, in German, my house is mein Haus. Okay, I will is ich will. Okay, there are a lot of basic similarities grammatically and in the language between English and German because they have the same origin. People came from Germany, and those people were called Anglo-Saxon. And Anglo, English, it's the same. Anglo-Saxon means English. English. So let's look at that on the slides. But here we've got these 4 countries and this United Kingdom. It started like this. First, Wales became under the control of England, and it did not have a separate flag. It just was considered to be part of England, controlled by England. And that was the first part of the British Isles that came under the control of the English after they had established control in what we call England. And then, a long time later, nearly 500 years later, Scotland joined together with England and the United Kingdom was born. That's at the end of our study period for this class. And then, 100 years after that, Ireland became part of the United Kingdom. So, that's the way that the United Kingdom grew up. Okay. But that's not the whole story. I want to tell the whole story up to today, just to explain something important. The next thing that happened was this little area here. Sorry, the color should be a little bit more different. Can you see the difference in color there? Okay. This area here. What happened in 1922? Most of Ireland decided to leave the United Kingdom. They did not have a positive experience with the United Kingdom. They had a very negative experience and they wanted to get out. However, the North wanted to remain. So today we have these three countries and the north of Ireland. So now it's the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. This part of Ireland is independent. It's a separate country. They have their own government. They have their own money. You know, they use the euro because they're part of the European community. Here they use the British pound. Okay, and they are separate. Okay. To talk about today's politics for a little minute, this is one of the very, very big problems with Brexit. You probably heard that before you were born, there were big political problems in Northern Ireland. People were killing each other. To stop the killing, one of the things they did was to open the border. You can cross freely from here to here. And as long as we're all European community, it doesn't matter. It's all Europe, it's all the same. All of Europe, you can go between France and Italy, you can go between Germany and Switzerland, it's open. It's like when you're in America, nobody's waiting at the edge of Texas to say, hey, you're going into another state, you have to show your passport. Right? The United States are united. You can travel anywhere inside them. Well, that's how Europe has become. So they were able to open up the border between these two countries. But if this country, this part, now leaves, what will happen between these two countries? 30 years ago, when there was a border, the atmosphere was very ugly. There was fighting, there was killing, there was violence. It was very unpleasant. 2 years ago, I went with my family and we're driving up here. Sometimes we didn't know, are we in Northern Ireland or are we in the south? And somebody, hey, it says 100 meters. Okay? No, now it says 100 yards. So it's the north. Okay? Or we go into a shop and we pay in pounds or we pay in euros. And in that way, we would know if we were in the north or the south. But there's nobody waiting to check your passport. It's open. But if Britain now leaves, what happens here? Okay? If we bring back a border with strict border control, there will be violence again. There will be problems. So that's today's history. But history changes the world, and it has its effect today. This situation in Northern Ireland began in the 16th and especially the 17th centuries. So we'll be studying the origin of this problem. Okay, what's going on here? How did Northern Ireland grow separate from the south? And that begins in our period, our Jedi. So Southern Ireland is independent, it's completely separate from the United Kingdom. So if the United Kingdom wants to leave Europe, it's Kanki and I for these people, they stay. They're not going to leave. Why should they? Okay, so we've got this Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, and that's quite an important part of what we'll be studying. Why, how did they become like two separate places? So I'm going to step back even further into the past here and look at how Europe got colonized. Now, there were humans in Europe before the Indo-European expansion, but the cultural remains of those people are very few. So effectively, European civilization as we know it today begins with this Indo-European period. And two of the Indo-European groups were the Celts and the Germans. There were others. Any idea who some of the others might have been? Not really. When I say them, or when you see it, you'll probably think, ah, naruhodo, okay, I see how it works now. But basically what happened was this. You had, I'd like to take away, yeah, an area here, somewhere around the kind of Ukraine kind of area. For some reason, it was a kind of cultural dynamo, and people split off into different directions from this area, taking their language and their culture with them. And we call it Indo-European because, as you can see, two groups went east, or this group split up later on. They spread around a huge area, making a huge language group. Now, this must seem very different and unfamiliar to you as Japanese people. Your language is not closely recognizably connected to other languages and other cultures. You use kanji like the Chinese do, but your language does not come from Chinese. Okay? They brought their writing system later on. There may be links between your language and Korean historically, but the differences today are so huge that there's not much similarity between the Japanese language and the Korean language. Japan is like, on its own, at the end of a very, very long branch, sort of, kind of just there, all right, without any close cousins or close relations. English is part of a big and complicated language group. So it's in a very different situation. It started here and spread out, as you can see, across a very large region at different periods. This would be the first emigration, the first 4,000 years ago. This is 3,000. And what you'll notice is that these differences in direction, these separations, the fact that these people left 1,000 years earlier, the fact that they went in different directions and had no contact with each other after they'd separated, means that the languages changed very, very quickly. There was no writing, spoken language changes more quickly than written language. Writing keeps it sort of, slows it down, okay? Just having only spoken language, the language can change very, very quickly. Some spoken languages in Australia today, for example, spoken by the Aborigine people, the grandchildren are speaking almost a completely different language from the grandparents. The language changes so much over a period of 50 or 60 years. So those kinds of changes were happening in these cultures. The languages were changing, and so we may not recognize them as being from the same origin unless we make a special study of it. So we've got now, focusing on Western Europe, we've got a picture something like this. And inside that, we've got the Scandinavian or Viking group, which is similar to, but not quite the same as, the German. We've got the Greek group, the Hellenic group here in the south. We've got the Latin or Roman group. And of course, that one today has spread out into Spanish, Italian, French. Okay, there are several languages which have their origin in Latin. The Iberian Celt over here, today they're speaking a Latin language, but originally they were speaking a different kind of language. They were speaking a Celtic language. And the Celtic or Gaelic people up here in Britain. And of course the Germanic people. You can see that the Germanic people are they'd separated off, all right, about 5,000 years ago, they'd separated off from the Germanic group. But there's a connection between them, just as there is between the Germanic and the Scandinavian. They're all connected. If you look at vocabulary, you look at the English word information, okay? You've got, in Spanish it's information, in French it's information, in Polish it's informatie, okay? It's similar across a wide number of languages, okay? Grammatical features, things that might look very different. Actually, the Latin quatuor, meaning four, and the English four have the same origin, just that one group, as it went along, couldn't pronounce f, so they say qua, okay? So quattro in Spanish, quatuor was the Latin word. The T somehow got lost and it became softer. In Welsh it's feather, and that in English it's four. It's the same origin though. Okay, people who studied these words back to their origin have created what they think is probably a dictionary of the original Indo-European language. Of course, we don't know because we can't prove it. But if you trace it back and you look at the way that words systematically changed, then you can get a pretty good idea of what the original language was probably like. So all of these languages coming back to the same origin, and all these cultures coming back to the same origin, but yet being significantly different from each other. So this is the situation in the British Isles. The Gaelic or Celtic people went there. Now there were earlier people, and we're never quite sure in history what happened. Did they kill the earlier people? Did they just be friendly and mix in with them in a friendly way? We don't know, okay? There are different theories about how it might have happened. Maybe a mixture of those things, okay? And that, of course, again, changes those people because as they intermarry, okay, whether it's by friendly intermarriage or whether it's just by battle and raping all the women, which is quite common, you know, however it happens, you're going to have a big mixing of blood, and you're probably going to have some language mixing going on at that stage as well. So those earlier people, though, don't survive as an identifiable culture. And so, as I said before, the big difference between the people of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland and the people of England is in their cultural origins, one group being Celtic and the other group being Germanic. Okay. So, again, let's go back to that geographical picture that we had. The British Isles. And sorry, just take us back there. You can see here also like mountainous regions. All right. This is the better land for farming. All right. Not high mountains. The mountains here, some mountains here, and also it's kind of remote. It's a long way from anywhere, and it's a very rainy country. The rain sweeps in from the sea, and well, generally there's a lot of rain in these islands, but this gets more rain than England is to some extent protected. Okay, being with Ireland here, England is protected from the winds and the rain coming in from the Atlantic. So it's the best land, it's the best bit. And as you can see, that's the bit that the English basically took. Now, when the Romans arrived in Britain, there were basically three groups of Celtic people there. This is what they found 2,000 years ago. They found the Brythonic Celts. You notice Brythonic, British. It's the same origin word. They were the ancient Britons. And those were the people that mostly in Roman times had contact with the Romans. Then there were the Irish people who were Gaelic Celts, sometimes called Goidelic Celts. And then there were the Scottish people. Now, it's not very clear. The Pictish people of Scotland, there are different theories. Were they Celtic? Were they not? When I studied this 30 years ago, the big theory was that they weren't Celtic. But now when I read it again, people have changed their minds and they think they probably were Celtic. So I don't really know. Nobody really knows. But it seems likely that they were Celtic. The language that we have today is certainly a Celtic language. Okay? So at some stage they mixed in with or became Celtic, but they're basically from these two groups are very similar in their language and in a lot of their culture. So Roman Britain covered this kind of area. They did not push into Scotland here. They did not push into Ireland. For them, this wall, I was born just next to this wall, which is still, you can still see parts of it. It's not very high, it's about this high, okay, but it still continues over across the country. 2,000 years later, a lot of it is still there. This was, for them, the worst place in the universe. It's where you went when you were really kind of being punished. The edge of the empire, cold. Imagine for Italian people, you know, up there near the Scottish border, cold, unfriendly people, and having to protect the Roman Empire across the wall that they built here. So those are the three groups of people that they found at that time. And the area that they took control of was basically most of the area that the Brythonic Celts occupied, this area. And then when they left, it's kind of interesting. The Romans were there for like 400 years, but they didn't seem to change anything very much. The basic culture, the basic society, the language, things continued as before. There was some kind of gairaigo from Latin. There were some influences. The Romans had become Christians by this stage. So Christianity was established across this area. The Romans built straight roads. You know, the Celtic people, they would say, you know, my farm is my farm is here and my house is here, but you know, I want to make a road so I can get easily to my farm, and so I'll make my road like this. Because, you know, Joe's got his land here, and Fred's got his house here, and, you know, okay, so I have to make my road like this. What did the Romans do? They made their roads, boom, like that. Did they care? Of course they didn't, okay? They just made their roads straight. And even today, we are using those Roman roads. The road from London to Scotland is a Roman road. It's dead straight. Okay? There are many roads around the English countryside that follow this pattern, but there are also many roads that follow this pattern. Many of these dead straight roads were created 2,000 years ago by the Romans. So that's one of the influences of the Roman period. Another influence from that time is the cities. London, as a city, was created by Julius Caesar. Okay? So there were some influences. Roads, cities, and Christianity were probably the main influences of the Romans. But otherwise, things continued as before, with Brythonic Celts, Gaelic Celts, and Pictish people. And when the Romans left, 410 AD was kind of a turning point because Rome itself was attacked and the Roman soldiers had to go back to protect their central homeland. When the Romans left, these islands were left unprotected. Yeah, so you can see like these roads and these cities, these were created by and this wall, Hadrian's Wall, by the Romans. So we're back to this situation, but no Romans. And because there's no protection from a strong army, the country is open to attack. And three Germanic peoples, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, slowly began to take over the lands of the ancient Britons. They pushed into these areas, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, pushing the Britons out. Okay? They didn't all get pushed out. Those who didn't go had a hard time. They were treated as slaves. And so we end up with a position like that. There are some Britons in this area. There are some Britons are in this area. But basically, they're being pushed out by the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who are Germanic people. And there are some Britons down here, but they don't have like a politically strong area. Okay? So just focusing on England and Wales here, we can see that these smaller countries start to grow up. Some of them are run by the Angles, some of them are run by the Saxons. These people, they're all from from different parts of Germany. They speak a slightly different language, they have a slightly different culture. As they all start living together in this area, the language starts mixing, and we get a language that we call Anglo-Saxon. We call the language Anglo-Saxon or Old English. Okay? When people say Shakespeare spoke Old English, Shakespeare spoke an English that's not so different from our English. Do you know any Shakespeare? Right? Can you quote anything? If I say to be or not to be, that is the question. You say, oh, that's Old English. No, that's our English, isn't it? To be or not to be, that is the question. And he continues, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. We can check all those words, they're still in the dictionary today, we still talk like that today. Okay? But Old English, no. Okay? If you open Beowulf, Anglo-Saxon epic, you won't understand, I won't understand it. I haven't studied Anglo-Saxon. It's like a different language. Okay? So, they spoke this Old English or Anglo-Saxon, which was the origin of today's English. So the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes occupy. Remember, we said this was the best land. Okay, they got it. And they had formed themselves into a number of kingdoms. Actually, at this time, Scotland and Wales and Ireland also consisted of smaller kingdoms. They were not united as countries. So this is the beginning of England, or Angle land, and the people were Anglo-Saxons. The language they spoke is called Anglo-Saxon or Old English. And its closest relative is German, because these people had come from Germany. And Anglo-Saxon is probably imademo. It's closer to German than to today's English, because today's English had different influences, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the first Anglo-Saxon settlers arrived about 450 AD, and in about 100 years, they formed these 7 different kingdoms. And then came the Vikings. Now, these people came from Scandinavia, and they established control in several parts of Britain, not just in England, but they had, in Scotland, around here, Ireland. They also established control. And these areas here that I'm showing as pink were what was called the Danelaw. Denmarkujing no Horitz. Okay? It was their territory. The Vikings established control in these areas. Sorry, before I continue to talk about the Normans, I should say the Romans and the Vikings were very powerful for a short time. Okay, the Romans took control of England. We can't say England, we can't really say England, but they took control of a part of Britain, and they were powerful. But when they left, they didn't leave very much. And the same is true of the Vikings. When the Viking period ended, it ended. Not much influence, not much trace. So basically that Anglo-Saxon culture continues to be the culture of England, and the Celtic culture continues to be the culture of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And then, basically, as I say, the Viking period started to come to an end when the English people united to fight against the Vikings. And then in 1066, in the 11th century, Vikings attacked the north of England. Vikings from Scandinavia. Now, the strategy of the Vikings was to send fighting people in boats I don't know how they did it. They went in small boats rowing across the ocean 1,000 kilometers or more in terrible conditions. When they arrived, they would kill everyone. Men, women, children, everyone. Just leave dead bodies and blood. They'd go back home and they would tell the farming people, this is where we went. They were very good at this, give very good explanations. And the farming people would go to the exact same place. They would take away the bodies, clean away the blood, and they would live there. And they would try very quickly to learn the local language. So that if anybody said, hey, we hear that Vikings killed people. No, we haven't seen any Vikings. Okay? So the Viking strategy was to adopt the local language. Because these were peaceful farming people. They weren't the warriors who'd done the killing. Okay? They didn't want to have to fight anybody. Well, one group of Vikings had come in this way, and they were attacking in the north of England. And the Saxon king, Harold, led an army northwards, and he defeated them. He beat the Vikings. But just afterwards, another group of Vikings who had been living in France for 200 years. So they spoke French. They didn't speak the Viking Scandinavian language. They spoke French. They attacked in the south. Harold's army was tired. They had fought a big battle. They had moved. The movement of the army was like this. They had moved north, okay, about 300 kilometers to fight in the north against the Vikings. Then they had to go another 300 or 100 or more kilometers south to fight against the Normans who were attacked here at Hastings. The Normans were originally Vikings. They'd been living for about 200 years in France, and they spoke French. And of course, the Saxon people lost. So 1066 is the turning point year for the England that we know now. The language, for example, why do you think when we go to a restaurant, that's a restaurant, okay? It's a French word. Why do you think they give us a menu? That's a menu. That's a French word. Okay? When I sit down here, I'm sitting on a chair. That's a chaise in French. It's a French word. This is a table. Okay? So many words, thousands and thousands of words came into English from French. So modern English is a little bit like Japanese, got a lot of vocabulary from Chinese. Okay, you've got the of kanji. In the same way, English got a lot of gairaigo from French. But it continues to be a Germanic language, just with a lot of French vocabulary. And that comes from these Norman people. They attacked in 1066, and they took control of the country. The Battle of Hastings took place in 1066. The Saxon king Harold was killed at Hastings, and the leader, William the Conqueror, the leader of the Normans, took control of England. Now, it's often said that Harold died with an arrow in his eye. This is probably a mistake. Okay, but it's a lot of the famous things in history aren't true. Marie Antoinette never said, let them eat cake. Okay, there are lots of things like this that just aren't true. And it's probably not true that Harold died with an arrow in his eye, but I learned it at school, that he died with an arrow in his eye. But he was killed at that battle. And the Anglo-Saxons were the second-class citizens under the power of the Normans, who were the rulers. So you had a strongly divided society with French-speaking people at the top and Anglo-Saxon or English, Old English-speaking people at the bottom. This is called the feudal system. The feudal system, the people at the bottom are called serfs. Serf, dore janai, dore no chikai. Okay, it's more or less, they're like slaves. And they're under the control of their Norman masters up there in the castle and the church. These two things dominate their lives. Their whole life is spent under the control of the Normans and the church. This goes on for several hundred years. There's the Norman castle. The style of building the castle was so that they could escape up into the top part. They could live down at the bottom part in peaceful times, but they could escape up into the top part if they were attacked. Because these Norman lords frequently attacked each other. Okay? And the church. This is what controlled people's lives. And the ordinary people were serfs. You may have wondered in English, why do we have two words for the meat and the animal? Because these people up at the top of the in the castle, they ate beef. But these people, the serfs, they never got to eat it. They only looked after the animal, the cow. So the cow is the animal, and coming from the Anglo-Saxon, and the beef is the meat coming from the French bœuf. Okay? It's the same with the pork. Okay? It's the meat. Okay? The Anglo-Saxon people would be dealing with swine or pigs, with the animals. Okay? Sheep, mutton, mouton in French. So the meat has one name because the lords would eat it, and the animal has a different name because they would never be able to eat it. They had to look after the animal and give the meat to the Norman masters. And yeah, language plays a big part in the way that society develops at this time. At first, of course, they're speaking different languages. Okay, the Anglo-Saxon person is speaking Old English and the Norman masters are speaking Norman French. But over a period of time, the languages start to merge together so that the Old English and the Norman French are getting mixed in. These people are starting to use French words in their English. These people are starting to use bits of English in their French. They're starting to mix together. We call this one Norman English. We call this one Anglo-Norman. Okay, this is English influenced by the Normans, and this is French influenced by the English language. And after about 300 years, the two languages became one language. So around about 1450, you've got the two a little bit before our period begins. So by the time we come to our period, the Tudor-Stuart period, we've got the two languages together. We've got early modern English. It'll still be true that high-class people will be using more French words, low-class people will be using more Germanic words, but basically it's one language. Okay? So 1450 is generally considered the end of the Chuseiji-dai, the end of the Middle Ages. It's also around about this time that we start getting the printing press coming in, the Arasenso, the fighting for the control of the country, which had been going on, also came to an end around about this time, a little bit later. We'll talk about that next week. But it was a turning point. again, quite different from Japanese history, where you can, it depends how you talk about Chusei Jidai in Japan. I think some people would say, yeah, that's, not so different, but the control, the absolute control of that continues right through until the Meiji period. Okay, all through the period, you've got that kind of feudal society, which we associate with Chusei. Okay, it's a very highly developed, in Japan's case, a very highly developed feudal system, but it's still a feudal system which we associate with the Middle Ages. So be careful, sometimes my students talk about Charles Dickens in the Middle Ages, or William, which is pretty bad, or William Shakespeare in the Middle Ages. That's also not correct. The Middle Ages have ended before our study period of Tudor and Stuart England. We call it early modern. It's the early modern period. And that's what we're going to be working on. And I've more or less finished, I think, telling you the background that will make it possible for us to begin next week studying that early modern period. So that's really everything, I think, for this week.